President Biden, following a speech on economic recovery this morning, found himself having to answer critics of that primetime rhetoric that he gave us last night in Philadelphia. Take a listen.
President, do you consider all Trump supporters to be a threat to the country?
Okay, so I don't consider any Trump supporter to be a threat to the country. I do think anyone who calls for the use of violence fails to condemn violence when it's used, refuses to acknowledge when an election has been won, insists upon changing the way in which the rules count votes. That is a threat to democracy. When people voted for Donald Trump and support him now, they weren't voting for attacking the Capitol. They weren't voting for overruling an election. They were voting for a philosophy he put forward.
So the president and his spokespeople the last 2 days trying to make that distinction, split that hair, thread that needle between attacking MAGA as leadership, Republican leadership, and rank and file the more than 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump. It's a tough distinction to make if you listen to that speech last night. Joining me now is Jason Nichols, a political commentator and senior lecturer at the University of Maryland. Go Terps. And Niall Stanage, White House columnist for our partners at The Hill. Okay, Niall, I'm going to start with you. Let's talk about the setting last night at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where he first spoke, 2 years ago on healing division in the country, just days after defeating Trump in 2020. But the staging and the lighting were foreboding, forbidding. They were stark, a little scary. What was the message there? Was that an intentional metaphor, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I know the lighting and all that has become an issue in the 24 hours since then, Mike, but I'm not sure that that's a really huge issue. I mean, isn't that just been used as a flag of convenience to attack the speech by people who didn't like attacking the speech, or didn't like the speech and wanted to attack it, I should say? I mean, this was a speech that was warning about existential dangers to American democracy. Now, one can take the view that there are such dangers, or there are not such dangers, or those dangers are being overplayed. But what colour of lights you have behind you at the time, I don't think that matters really much, honestly.
Point taken, Niall. I think sometimes in Washington we do focus too much on the staging, but it was striking to me, the color that we choose. Okay, Jason, let me ask you, clearly the president has ditched the unity angle in favor of a harsher tone. He's seen a spike in poll numbers. Do you see a cause and effect relationship there? Is this causation or correlation, as I learned back at Maryland in my philosophy course?
Well, go Terps indeed first, I have to say. But I think that I think it was a little bit of causation. I think that he made this speech at a time when he is seeing a spike in popularity. People are more open to hearing his message. And I have to say, he looked strong. He looked, you didn't see the Biden gaffes. You didn't see him stumble or fumble over words. He looked in command. He looked very much like the strong commander-in-chief. He had the Marines behind him. I think that actually, as much as I mostly agree with Niall, I think the setting actually mattered. I think having the Marines behind him and the flag behind him, and I think that red kind of background also said that this is an existential threat, that there are people who are threatening our democracy, that there are people who wanted to kidnap a governor and rushed our Capitol and harmed police officers. I think he really wanted to send that message, and I think it got home to the crowd that it was supposed to hit, which is the sliver of people in the middle.
Yeah, and Niall, that's sort of the point here. The White House has clearly figured out that this is a winner for them. As I said at the top, instead of a referendum, as most midterms are, on the current president, he's trying to make it about the last president. So how can the president attack an entire political movement, and again, trying to split that hair, thread that needle, and not say it's about the millions upon millions of Trump supporters when he unleashes rhetoric like he did last night?
Now, I want to be very clear up front. Not every Republican, not even the majority of Republicans are MAGA Republicans. Not every Republican embraces their extreme ideology. There are far more Americans from every background and belief who reject the extreme MAGA ideology than those that accept it.
Okay, Niall, it was billed as a speech about the soul of the nation, clearly a campaign and a political speech 2 months out from the midterm. What's the strategy here? What does the White House believe the vulnerability on the part of Republicans is?
I think there are a few things there. I think that partly they believe that tying the Republican Party as closely as possible to former President Trump is useful from their perspective. It was interesting to me that in a passage in the speech last night, President Biden tied the MAGA movement very directly to the Supreme Court and the verdict on abortion.
Yeah.
Democrats believe that that issue, the abortion issue, is playing to their advantage. And then also, while we're talking here about Republicans, I do also think there was clearly an impetus here to motivate Democrats to actually get to the polls. Of course, Democratic voters are going to broadly agree with what the president said. But as you know, there has been a criticism on the left that the president has not taken on his predecessor or taken on the MAGA movement more frontally and more confrontationally. And so he was doing that.
Yeah, I think that's an underemphasized point about this. He's trying to get Democratic base voters to the polls in a midterms when his poll numbers are down. He's trying to energize them, close that enthusiasm gap. Jason, in some cases, Democrats on the campaign have been supporting MAGA candidates in Republican primaries to try to sort of manipulate, pick the opponent that they want in the general election, a favorable midterm matchup. Isn't there a gigantic kind of hypocrisy at play there? And that just really upset some members of the Democratic base.
Yeah, I mean, it upset me. I thought it was a grave mistake. I think it's a place where they can fumble in a lot of areas. Now, in our home state of Maryland, I think it's probably going to work pretty well when you've got someone who's a neo-Confederate and Dan Cox running against someone who's as patriotic as Wes Moore. But there are a lot of places where this is going to backfire, and I would hate to see a situation where you call for a battle for the soul of America, and you're talking about the existential threat that the MAGA movement plays, and then all of a sudden you're getting them elected and they actually pull out some victories. So I think this was a really bad thing that the Democratic committee did.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit earlier about the Colorado Senate race. It might backfire there. Okay, Jason Nichols and Niall Stanage, thank you very much, very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to subscribe. Click the red button to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.